The sun rose over the industrial district like a reluctant judge, its light falling on corrugated metal and cracked asphalt with neither favor nor mercy. The air carried the weight of a city already in motion, diesel exhaust, mixing with the sweet decay of summer turning to fall. In the skeletal landscape of shuttered factories and chain-link territories, Marcus Reeves opened the rolling door of his garage with movements that suggested ritual rather than routine. The space inside was a cathedral of the practical. Every tool hung in its designated place, shadows drawn in permanent marker on pegboard so that absence became immediately visible. The floor, though stained by years of mechanical surgery, bore the systematic cleanliness of someone who understood that chaos in the workspace meant chaos in the mind. Three vehicle bays stretched deep into the building, each one a theater where broken things came to be made whole again. The smell was honest motor oil and metal shavings, brake dust, and the ghost of welding smoke. No air fresheners masked it. This was work, and work had its own perfume. Marcus moved through the space with an economy that spoke of muscle memory carved deep. His hands scarred across the knuckles and stained in the creases with grease that no amount of scrubbing ever fully erased, reached for a socket wrench without his eyes needing to confirm its location. He was 42, but carried himself with the posture of a man 20 years younger. His movements fluid rather than efficient, as if his body existed in a perpetual state of readiness for something his conscious mind had long since dismissed as irrelevant to his current life. The sedan waiting in Bay 2 had been coughing black smoke for a week before its owner finally admitted defeat and called. Marcus had diagnosed the problem within 30 seconds of hearing the engine turn over a failed, positive crankcase ventilation valve, allowing oil into the intake manifold, but he went through the full diagnostic protocol anyway. Trust was built on thoroughness, not shortcuts. His reputation in this part of the city rested on two principles. He fixed things right the first time, and he charged exactly what the work was worth, never a dollar more. Behind him in the small office carved from the corner of the garage, Lily was constructing a universe from crayons and imagination. At 6 years old, she possessed the kind of focus that adults mistook for daydreaming, but was actually a form of world-building far more complex than most corporate strategy sessions. The bluebird taking shape on her paper had started as an assignment from her first-grade teacher, draw your favorite animal, but had evolved into something more. The bird lived in a forest made of mechanical parts, its nest built from spark plugs and timing belts, a reflection of the only world she had ever known. She sat cross-legged on a cushion atop an overturned plastic crate, her station positioned where Marcus could see her through the office window whenever he glanced up from his work. The arrangement was unspoken, but absolute. She had her territory, he had his. Their orbits intersected at precise intervals throughout the day, breakfast at 7, a mid-morning break for juice and crackers, lunch at noon, an afternoon walk to the park 3 blocks away if the weather cooperated. Structure was love made visible, and Marcus built their days with the same precision he applied to rebuilding transmissions. The girl had her mother's eyes, dark and luminous, capable of communicating entire emotional weather systems without a single word. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, her absence a presence that filled every corner of their lives. The accident had been ruled no fault, a semi-truck's brake failure, a physics problem that allowed for no human solution. Marcus had been deployed when it happened 7,000 miles away, in a place that didn't exist on any official map, doing work that would never appear in any public record. By the time they extracted him and flew him back to Dover Air Force Base, Sarah had been in the ground for 2 days. He had missed the funeral. He had missed the chance to say goodbye. He had missed everything that mattered. The discharge papers came 6 weeks later, honorable with commendations that would remain classified until long after his death, if they were ever declassified at all. His commanding officer had tried to convince him to stay, offering positions that would keep him stateside, keep him near Lily. But Marcus knew himself well enough to understand that the work would always find a way to pull him back. The life he had lived for 15 years was not the kind that allowed for partial commitment. It demanded everything, and he had nothing left to give it. He had a daughter who needed a father, not a ghost who appeared between deployments with hollow eyes and hands that shook when they were still. The garage had been Sarah's idea, conceived during one of his rare periods of leave. She had pointed at the for sale sign on the abandoned mechanic's shop and said with absolute conviction that it was theirs, that it was where their real life would begin, when the pretend life of the military finally released its hold on him. She had believed in futures with the same intensity that Marcus had once believed in missions. The irony of buying the place with her life insurance money was not lost on him, but he chose to see it as keeping a promise rather than betrayal. This was what she had wanted. This was what Lily needed. This was enough. The wrench in his hand torqued with precisely calibrated force, the bolt yielding at the exact moment it should. Muscle memory from 1,000 similar motions, but also from training that went far deeper than automotive repair. His instructors at the schoolhouse had been clear. Every action is training for every other action. The way you tie your shoes teaches you how to rig explosives. The way you make your bed teaches you how to clear a room. The way you treat tools teaches you how to treat weapons. Everything was practice for everything else. He finished the PCV valve replacement and moved on to checking the spark plugs, finding 3 of them fouled beyond cleaning. The owner had been running cheap gas, probably from the discount station on Roosevelt Avenue, where half the pumps were suspected of watering down their product. Marcus made a note to suggest a fuel system cleaning along with the new plugs. The work was honest, the diagnosis was sound, and the customer would drive away with a car that ran better than it had in months. Small victories in a world that often felt engineered for failure. Lily's voice broke through the mechanical silence, high and clear, like a bell in still air. "Daddy, what color is happy?" The question deserved better than a distracted answer. Marcus set down his tools and walked to the office doorway and wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered to permanent discoloration. She was holding up 2 crayons, one yellow and one orange, her face scrunched in the serious concentration of someone wrestling with a genuine philosophical problem. "That depends on who's feeling it. What makes you happy?" She considered this with the gravity it deserved, her small fingers turning the crayons over as if their weight might provide the answer. "When we go to the park and you push me really high on the swings, that's yellow happy. Orange happy is when we make pancakes on Sunday." The logic was flawless, the emotional cartography perfect. He felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation that had become familiar over the past 3 years, pride and grief in equal measure, wonder at the person she was becoming, mixed with sorrow for the person who should have been here to witness it. "Then your bird should be yellow. Flying is the highest kind of happiness." She nodded, accepting this wisdom, and returned to her work with renewed purpose. Marcus watched for a moment longer, memorizing the scene, his daughter in a pool of morning light, creating meaning from wax and paper, safe in a world he had built from the ruins of the one they lost. Then he returned to the sedan, to the honest work of fixing broken things. Across the city, in a tower of glass and steel that seemed to challenge the sky itself, Eleanor Vance prepared for war. The conference room on the 43rd floor of Vance Dynamics headquarters was designed to intimidate floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view that reduced the city below to an abstract pattern of light and shadow, a table of polished obsidian that reflected faces like a dark mirror, chairs, engineered for discomfort to ensure meetings never ran longer than necessary. She had commissioned the space herself, understanding that environment shaped behavior and behavior shaped outcomes. The presentation on the screen showed failure in excruciating detail. The Aegis autonomous defense drone, $300 million of research and development compressed into a sleek carbon fiber chassis, had fallen from the sky like a shot bird during its 4th field test. The telemetry data painted a picture of catastrophic systems failure, multiple redundant safety protocols, somehow failing simultaneously in a cascade that should have been statistically impossible. Impossible, but documented in high-definition video that would be dissected by Pentagon analysts looking for any excuse to void the contract and redirect funding to one of Vance Dynamics' competitors. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, her posture a weapon she had sharpened over 2 decades of corporate warfare. Tailored suit in charcoal gray, cut to suggest authority without theatricality. Hair pulled back in a style that added 5 years to her 38, but also added gravitas, which in boardrooms mattered more than beauty. Minimal jewelry, a watch that cost more than most people's cars, but appeared understated, earrings selected for geometric precision rather than sparkle. She had learned early that women in her position faced a calculation. Men never had to consider appear too feminine and be dismissed as decorative, appear too masculine and be labeled aggressive. She had chosen a third path, appear utterly competent, so thoroughly in command that gender became irrelevant to the conversation. "Walk me through the failure sequence one more time," And this time I want to hear theories, not excuses. The engineering lead, a man named Peterson, who had come from Boeing with a resume that read like a greatest hits album of aerospace achievement, manipulated the display with shaking hands. He had been confident a month ago, cocky, even certain that the Aegis would revolutionize military drone technology the way the Predator had in the early 2000s. Now he looked like a man watching his legacy disintegrate in real time. At T plus 90 seconds altitude, 800 feet, the primary flight controller reported all systems nominal. At T plus 91 seconds, the stabilization authority began degrading. Not failing degrading like someone was slowly turning down a dial. By T plus 95, we had zero control authority. The drone entered a flat spin and impacted the test range at terminal velocity. Hardware or software? Peterson's hesitation told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. We don't know. The flight controller survived impact, but the diagnostic logs show nothing. No error codes, no anomalies, no indication of malfunction. According to the data, the drone was functioning perfectly right up until it wasn't. Eleanor felt the familiar cold that settled into her spine when a problem revealed itself to be deeper than its surface suggested. She had built Vance Dynamics from a two-person startup in a rented office to a defense contractor bidding on nine-figure projects through a combination of technical brilliance and predatory instinct. She knew when she was being hunted, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming that this was not a technical failure. This was sabotage. I want the entire software stack audited. Every line of code, every compiled binary, every firmware update. I want hardware teardowns of every component. I want background checks rerun on everyone with access to the development environment. And I want it finished by end of business Friday. The room absorbed this demand in silence. It was Tuesday. What she was asking for would normally take a month. Peterson opened his mouth to explain the impossibility, caught the look in her eyes, and closed it again. She saw the calculation happening behind his expression, argue and be fired or accept the impossible and hope for a miracle. The miracle won. Yes, ma'am, we'll get it done. As the team filed out, Eleanor remained at the window, her reflection a ghost in the glass. Below, the city crawled with life cars threading through arteries of asphalt, people reduced to pixels from this height, the whole vast machinery of commerce and survival turning according to rules that felt increasingly arbitrary to her. She had spent 20 years climbing first through MIT's graduate programs, then through the ranks of corporate America driven by a hunger she had never quite been able to name. Success had always felt like the answer to a question she had forgotten how to ask. Her phone vibrated with a message from Julian Croft, the name appearing on the screen with the little heart emoji he had added to his own contact entry without asking her permission. The presumption had irritated her when she first noticed it, but she had never deleted it. That seemed important now, though she wasn't certain why. Dinner tonight, I'm thinking per se. We should celebrate. The message arrived without context, as if he assumed she would automatically know what required celebrating. This was typical Julian, confident, to the point of assumption, always operating from the premise that his priorities naturally aligned with everyone else's. In the beginning, this quality had seemed like leadership. Lately, it was starting to feel like something else. She typed a response. Celebrate what exactly? Our drone just cratered at 800 feet. The reply came within seconds. All part of the process. Edison failed 1,000 times before the light bulb. Dinner. The comparison was absurd. Edison had been working with his own money and reputation. They were working with Department of Defense funding and contracts that included penalty clauses capable of bankrupting the company. But she agreed to dinner anyway, partly because the thought of returning to her apartment alone felt more exhausting than making conversation, and partly because Julian was the project lead on Aegis. If there were sabotage, she needed to read his reactions up close. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of crisis management. Calls with investors who had read the early reports about the test failure and were now circling like sharks around a wounded swimmer. Emails to Pentagon liaisons assuring them that the anomaly was being addressed and that the next demonstration would exceed all performance specifications. A carefully worded press release that acknowledged a setback while framing it as part of the normal development process, as if $300 million machines falling from the sky was simply the cost of innovation. By noon, Eleanor's assistant had fielded 43 requests for comment from industry press, each one phrased slightly differently, but all asking the same fundamental question: Was Vance Dynamics about to collapse? The vultures were gathering. Competitors who had lost the Aegis contract were already preparing their own proposals, ready to swoop in the moment Vance showed weakness. This was how the game worked. You were either the predator or the prey, and the moment you stopped moving forward, you became meat. Lunch was a salad at her desk consumed without tasting while reviewing financial projections. The company could survive one more test failure, maybe two, if they were careful about how they managed the narrative. But beyond that, the penalty clauses would start triggering, and the whole carefully constructed edifice of debt and investment would come crashing down. She had leveraged everything on Aegis, her reputation, the company's resources, her personal fortune. It was the kind of all-in bet that either created empires or ended careers. Middle ground was not an option. Her phone rang, Julian's name on the screen again, but this time a call rather than a text. She let it ring 3 times before answering, an old habit from the days when she had been building her first startup and needed to maintain the illusion that she was too busy to be immediately available. "I know you're swamped, but this can't wait. We need to talk about Peterson's audit plan." His voice had the forced casualness of someone trying to appear unconcerned. Eleanor's attention sharpened. "What about it?" "It's overkill. We know the failure was hardware-related. The servos on the vertical stabilizer showed signs of stress fracture in the post-crash analysis. Tearing apart the entire software stack is a waste of time and resources we don't have. Peterson's preliminary report mentioned no such fracture." A pause, brief but perceptible. "That's because it's a secondary analysis. I have the metallurgy report right here. I can send it over." Eleanor pulled up Peterson's email, scanning for any mention of structural failure. Nothing. She kept her voice level, giving away nothing. "Send it. I want to see the raw data, not just the summary." "Of course, I'll forward it as soon as we hang up. But seriously, Elle, we need to stay focused on the actual problem instead of chasing ghosts in the code. Every day we spend on this audit is a day we're not fixing the real issue." The nickname landed wrong, too familiar for the conversation they were having. She had never particularly liked being called Elle, but Julian used it constantly, as if their personal relationship granted him access to informality and professional contexts. She made a mental note of his eagerness to steer her away from the software audit and filed it under the growing list of things that didn't quite add up. "We'll pursue both vectors. The Pentagon is paying for thoroughness, and that's what they'll get. See you at dinner." She ended the call before he could respond and immediately opened her contact list, scrolling to a name she hadn't accessed in months. Richard Moss, formerly of the Defense Intelligence Agency, currently the head of her corporate security division. She had hired him away from the government at considerable expense because he possessed 2 qualities she valued above all others. In security personnel, he was ruthlessly competent and he was loyal to whoever signed his paycheck rather than to abstract principles. The call connected on the first ring. "Miss Vance, I was expecting you'd reach out after this morning's excitement. I need a background check. Discreet, thorough, and fast." "Who?" She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Julian Croft. I want to know everywhere he's been, everyone he's talked to, every financial transaction, every email, every phone call, everything." If Moss was surprised, his voice gave no indication. "That's going to require some ethical gray areas. He's the project lead, which means he's got privileged access to your systems and communications. Technically, we'd be violating his privacy. Technically, he signed an employment agreement that gives me broad authority to investigate potential security threats. I'm invoking that authority. Do you need it in writing?" "No, ma'am. I'll have a preliminary report by tomorrow morning. Full workup by Friday." After the call ended, Eleanor remained motionless at her desk, staring at her reflection in the dark glass of her monitor. The face that stared back looked tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. When had she become the kind of person who investigated her fiancé? When had the instincts that made her successful in business started bleeding into her personal life? Or had they always been there and Julian was simply the first person close enough for her to notice? The afternoon dissolved into more calls, more emails, more crisis management. At 6 o'clock, her assistant appeared in the doorway with a look of practiced neutrality. "Mr. Croft is here for dinner. He's waiting in the lobby." Eleanor glanced at her calendar. The reservation was at 7:30. Julian was an hour early, which meant he wanted to talk before they left the building, which meant he was worried about something. She considered making him wait, asserting dominance through the simple expedient of delayed gratification then decided against it. Better to see what he was anxious about while he was still off balance. Send him up. Julian Croft entered her office with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously contemplated failure. At 41, he retained the athletic build of his collegiate soccer days, maintained through a religious devotion to morning runs and a personal trainer who cost more per hour than most people made in a day. His suit was Armani, his shoes handmade in Italy, his watch a limited edition Patek Philippe that he claimed to wear ironically but clearly treasured. He had the kind of handsomeness that aged well-strong jawline eyes, the color of expensive whiskey hair, beginning to silver at the temples in a way that suggested gravitas rather than decline. They had met at an industry conference 2 years ago, struck up a conversation about the future of autonomous warfare that had evolved into drinks, then dinner, then a weekend in Napa, that Eleanor remembered more for the quality of the wine than the quality of the company. The relationship had developed with the same strategic precision she applied to business deals, compatible schedules, aligned ambitions, mutual benefit. Love had never been part of the equation, which suited her fine. Love was a variable she had seen destroy too many promising careers through poor decision-making and compromised judgment. Julian kissed her on the cheek, a gesture she neither encouraged nor rejected. You look exhausted. This morning really did a number on you, didn't it? The observation, though accurate, irritated her precisely because of its accuracy. She didn't want to look exhausted. She wanted to project invulnerability, the armor she had spent decades constructing brick by brick. I look like someone managing a crisis. Speaking of which, I'm still waiting for that metallurgy report. About that, he settled into one of the chairs across from her desk, his posture deliberately relaxed in a way that suggested rehearsal. I may have jumped the gun. The report I was looking at was from the second test failure, not this most recent one. My mistake. The admission came too smoothly, too practiced. Eleanor studied his face, searching for the micro-expressions that would betray deception. She had trained herself to read people the way mechanics read engine sounds, the subtle indicators that something was misfiring beneath the surface. But Julian's face remained open, guileless, radiating nothing but mild embarrassment. So there's no structural evidence suggesting hardware failure? Not yet, but the analysis is ongoing. I'm confident we'll find something. These kinds of catastrophic failures don't just happen. There's always a root cause. That's what concerns me. Root causes can be engineered. The words hung between them, shifting the temperature of the conversation. Julian's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened, a door closing behind glass. Are you suggesting sabotage? I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities. A project this valuable has competitors who would benefit from our failure. We'd be naive not to consider industrial espionage. He nodded slowly as if absorbing this logic for the first time. That's why you ordered the full audit. You think someone on the inside is compromised. I think someone on the inside has access, and access plus motivation equals risk. The audit will tell us if the code has been tampered with. And if it hasn't, then we move on to other theories. But we do it systematically, eliminating variables until we find the answer. Julian stood, moving to the window where she had stood that morning, both of them drawn to the same vantage point, as if height could provide perspective on problems that existed in dimensions money and power couldn't reach. You know what I love about you, Elle? You never panic. Most people in your position would be throwing things, blaming the team, looking for scapegoats. But you just get colder, more focused. It's like watching a machine optimize itself in real time. The compliment felt like an insult, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. She joined him at the window, their reflections overlapping in the glass. Panic is inefficient. It doesn't solve problems. Neither does paranoia. The word landed like a slap. She turned to look at him directly, no longer mediated by glass and reflection. Caution isn't paranoia, it's survival. There's a line between the two, and I worry you're about to cross it. The conversation was spiraling into territory she hadn't intended to explore, personal grievances, masquerading as professional concern. She checked her watch, a gesture designed to reset the interaction. We should head to dinner. The reservation is in 40 minutes. The restaurant was everything Julian loved, and Eleanor tolerated theatrical presentation. Microscopic portions arranged like abstract art wines, selected more for their rarity than their taste. They sat at a corner table that afforded privacy while still allowing Julian to be seen by the other patrons, many of whom recognized him from industry publications. He worked the room with effortless charm, acknowledging acquaintances with subtle nods that communicated both recognition and the boundary that conversation would not be welcome. The meal proceeded through its predetermined choreography. Amuse-bouche, first course, second course, each one arriving with a detailed explanation from the server about ingredients and preparation techniques that Eleanor suspected were partly invented to justify the prices. She nodded along, tasting without eating, where mine is still circling the problem of Aegis like a shark around wounded prey. Julian ordered his third glass of wine, a Bordeaux, that cost more than Marcus would charge for a week's worth of work, and leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed the evening was going well. I've been thinking about what you said about sabotage. If there is someone on the inside working against us, the audit won't catch them. These people are too smart to leave obvious traces. These people, Eleanor set down her fork. You sound like you have specific suspects in mind. Not suspects, profiles. If I were going to sabotage a project like Aegis, I'd target the firmware low-level enough to cause catastrophic failure, high-level enough to avoid leaving traces in the hardware. And I'd need someone with deep knowledge of drone flight systems, probably military experience. The analysis was sound, which made it more troubling. Either Julian was thinking through the problem in good faith, or he was laying groundwork to point suspicion toward a convenient scapegoat. Eleanor filed the theory away for later examination. We have 17 people with that profile in the development team. Are you suggesting we suspect of all of them? I'm suggesting we look for patterns, financial irregularities, sudden lifestyle changes, contact with competitors, classic counterintelligence protocols. He was right, which made her mistrust him more. The Julian she thought she knew was brilliant with technology, but naive about human nature, capable of engineering elegant solutions, but blind to the political machinations that surrounded him. This version, calculating, strategic, already thinking in terms of counterintelligence, felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The dessert arrived, some confection involving nitrogen and edible flowers. Julian attacked it with enthusiasm while Eleanor pushed hers around the plate, watching the foam dissolve into nothing. You're not eating. I'm thinking. About the audit or about us? The question came without preamble, shifting the conversation from professional to personal with the abruptness of a gear change without the clutch. Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes across the table. Are those separate things? They should be. But with you, I'm never quite sure where the boardroom ends and the relationship begins. It was perhaps the most honest thing he had said all evening. She considered lying, offering some reassurance that would smooth over the friction she could feel building between them. But dishonesty took energy, and she had none to spare. Everything connects, Julian. That's not a weakness. It's how I see the world. It's also lonely. So is failure. The words fell between them like a dropped glass, the sound of something breaking that couldn't be easily repaired. Julian's expression cycled through several emotions too quickly for Eleanor to catalog, settling finally on a kind of resigned sadness. I proposed to you 6 months ago. You said yes, but I don't think you've ever actually decided to marry me. I think you're still running the cost-benefit analysis. The accusation was accurate enough to sting. She had accepted his proposal in the afterglow of closing a major contract, riding high on success, and the champagne that had accompanied it. The ring had appeared 3 carats flawless, clarity set in platinum, and saying yes had felt like the logical next step in a life built on logical steps. But he was right. She had never stopped analyzing the decision, never allowed herself to simply commit without constantly recalculating whether the equation balanced. I don't know how to be any other way. I know. That's what worries me. They finished the meal in relative silence, the conversation turning to safe topics, mutual acquaintances, upcoming industry conferences, the mundane logistics of shared calendars. The check arrived, Julian paid despite her offer to split it, and they emerged onto the street where his car was waiting. The driver opened the door and Julian turned to her with a question in his eyes. Your place or mine? Eleanor felt a wave of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hour. The thought of performing intimacy, of pretending that the distance between them was merely physical rather than fundamental, felt impossible. Mine, but I need to work. The audit reports will start coming in tonight. His disappointment was visible but controlled. Of course. Work. Always work. The drive to her apartment in Tribeca passed in silence, broken only by the sounds of the city beyond the car's windows. Julian scrolled through his phone, his face illuminated by the screen's blue glow, while Eleanor stared out at the streets where normal people lived, normal lives, going to normal jobs, having normal relationships, operating according to rules she had never quite learned. When they arrived, Julian walked her to the lobby but didn't push to come up. Get some rest, Elle. The crisis will still be there tomorrow. She watched him return to the car, watched it pull away into traffic, and felt nothing but relief at his absence. The elevator carried her up 32 floors to an apartment that cost $8 million and felt like a hotel room she had been living in temporarily for the past 4 years. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, a kitchen that had never been used for actual cooking. The only personal touch was a photograph on the mantel, her mother taken 2 months before the cancer killed her, smiling with an openness that Eleanor had inherited but never learned to access. She poured a glass of wine she didn't drink and opened her laptop, pulling up the first of the audit reports that had begun arriving during dinner. Line after line of code, thousands upon thousands of instructions that formed the digital nervous system of the Aegis drone. Looking for sabotage in this was like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Possible, but requiring resources and time they didn't have. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard Moss. Preliminary Croft report attached. You're not going to like it. The attachment was a PDF heavily redacted but still readable. Financial records showing wire transfers to an offshore account in the Caymans. Email metadata indicating encrypted communications with addresses that bounce through anonymizing servers. A pattern of behavior consistent with someone hiding something. Not proof of sabotage, but smoke suggesting fire. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, the familiar sensation of the walls closing in. The man she was supposed to marry was either betraying her company or being set up to look like he was. Neither option offered comfort. She had spent 20 years building an empire on the principle that she could trust her own judgment, that careful analysis and rigorous logic would protect her from the chaos that destroyed other people's lives. But the data in front of her suggested that she had been catastrophically wrong about someone she had let inside her defenses. The wine glass sat untouched as she read through the report again, looking for alternative explanations. Perhaps the offshore account was legitimate tax planning. Perhaps the encrypted emails were simply Julian being paranoid about corporate espionage. Perhaps she was seeing patterns that didn't exist, projecting her own paranoia onto innocent data. But Eleanor had built her career on trusting the data over intuition, and the data was screaming that something was wrong. She opened a secure chat window to Moss. Continue the investigation. I need to know for certain. His response came immediately. Understood. This goes deep, Ms. Vance. Deeper than a simple case of industrial espionage. Whatever he's into, it's organized. Professional. The words confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't one person acting alone. This was a conspiracy, and Julian was either its architect or its tool. Either way, her company was in danger. Her professional reputation was at stake, and the man she was supposed to marry was at the center of it all. She closed the laptop and moved to the window, looking out over the city that never slept. Somewhere down there, millions of people were living their lives according to scripts she would never understand, falling in love without calculating the return on investment, trusting people without requiring background checks, building connections that didn't serve any strategic purpose beyond simple human warmth. She had sacrificed all of that on the altar of success, convinced that power was the only protection that mattered. But power hadn't protected her from this. Power had simply made her a more valuable target. The next morning arrived cold and gray autumn, asserting itself with rain that fell in sheets against the towers of Midtown. Eleanor arrived at her office before 6, beating even the dedicated overachievers on her executive team. She had slept for maybe 3 hours, her dreams populated by falling drones and Julian's face dissolving into equations she couldn't solve. The audit reports continued to arrive throughout the morning, each one more technical than the last. Peterson's team was being thorough, documenting every line of code, every compiled binary, every firmware update. But they were finding nothing. No logic bombs, no backdoors, no evidence of tampering, which meant either the sabotage was so sophisticated it had evaded their detection, or it didn't exist in the software at all. At 10 o'clock, Eleanor called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. They gathered in the war room, a conference space designed for crisis management with multiple screens for displaying data and secure communications equipment that prevented electronic eavesdropping. Julian arrived last, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, his usual polish replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Peterson presented the audit findings, or rather the lack of findings. We've examined 93% of the code base. No anomalies, no unauthorized modifications, no indication of digital tampering. Whatever caused the Aegis failure, it's not in the software. Eleanor let the silence stretch, watching the faces around the table. Most showed relief. No sabotage meant no insider threat, no criminal investigation, no public scandal. But Julian looked stricken, as if the good news was somehow the worst possible outcome. That leaves hardware. I want a complete teardown of every component with metallurgical analysis of any piece that could have contributed to the failure. Julian finally spoke, his voice tight. That will take weeks. We don't have weeks. The next demo is scheduled for 14 days from now. Then we delay it. We can't. The Pentagon liaison made it clear another delay and they pulled the contract. It's now or never. The room absorbed this ultimatum. Everything they had worked for, everything Eleanor had built, compressed into a 2-week window. Success meant vindication and a contract worth $750 million. Failure meant bankruptcy and the end of Vance Dynamics. Eleanor looked around the table, reading the fear in their eyes. These were brilliant people, engineers and strategists, who had devoted years to making Aegis a reality. But brilliance without direction was useless, and she could feel them starting to panic, starting to fracture under the pressure. We proceed with the demo as scheduled, but we run parallel testing every day until then. Every system, every component tested to failure and beyond. If there's a weakness, we'll find it. The team filed out, leaving Eleanor alone with Julian. He remained seated, his hands flat on the table as if bracing himself against invisible force. I need to tell you something. The words carried weight that made Eleanor's instincts sharpen. I'm listening. The offshore account, the encrypted emails. I know Moss is investigating me, and I know what it looks like. But it's not what you think. Then explain it. Julian's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like genuine anguish. I've been working on a side project, a startup idea that would compete with some of Vance's peripheral businesses. I knew you'd see it as a betrayal, so I kept it quiet. The offshore account was for establishing the corporate entity. The encrypted emails were with potential investors. The explanation was plausible. Not innocent, but plausible. Corporate executives pursuing side projects that competed with their employers was technically a violation of most employment agreements, but it was common enough that Eleanor had heard similar stories dozens of times. She studied his face, looking for the tells that would reveal deception. Show me. The business plan, the investor, communications, all of it. I will. But you have to understand, I wasn't trying to sabotage Vance. I was trying to build something of my own. To prove that I'm not just the guy you hired to run your projects. I need to be more than that. The confession was perhaps more honest than he intended. Eleanor heard the subtext loud and clear. He resented being in her shadow, resented the power imbalance in their relationship, resented that her name was on the building, while his was merely on an office door. It was a resentment she understood intellectually, but couldn't quite sympathize with. She had built Vance Dynamics from nothing. He had been hired into a senior position with a generous salary and equity package. Their situations were not equivalent. We'll discuss your side project after we get through the next 2 weeks. Right now, I need you focused on Aegis. Can you do that? He nodded, but the conviction in his eyes was already wavering. Of course, Aegis is the priority. After he left, Eleanor remained in the war room, staring at the screens that still displayed audit data and test reports. She had a fiancé who was pursuing competitors behind her back, a flagship product that kept catastrophically failing for reasons no one could identify, and 2 weeks to solve both problems or watch everything she had built collapse into ruin. The walls she had constructed around her life, the fortress of power and control she had spent 20 years building, were revealing themselves to be far more fragile than she had ever imagined. Her phone rang, Moss, his voice carrying an urgency that made her stomach clench. We have a problem. I've been tracking Julian's encrypted communications, and one of the addresses he's been in contact with just got flagged by a federal law enforcement. It's associated with a foreign intelligence service. This isn't just corporate espionage, Ms. Vance. This might be something much bigger. The city stretched in all directions beyond the windows, indifferent to the personal catastrophes being lived out in its towers and tunnels. Eleanor felt the familiar cold settling into her spine, the sensation that had become her constant companion, the knowledge that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, and that the price of her success might be a loneliness so complete it bordered on extinction. 18 miles away, Marcus finished installing new brake pads on a pickup truck that had come in grinding metal on metal. The owner, a construction foreman named Rodriguez, had been putting off the work for months, convinced he could squeeze another few thousand miles out of them. Marcus didn't lecture. He simply showed Rodriguez the scored rotors, explaining in simple terms how metal-on-metal braking worked and why the longer you waited, the more expensive the fix became. Education was better than judgment. Lily had finished her Bluebird and moved on to a new project, a portrait of the two of them at the park, rendered in her distinctive style that combined observation with imagination. She had drawn Marcus pushing her on a swing, but the swing was flying impossibly high, almost reaching a sun she had colored purple, because as she explained, purple was the color of magic. Marcus washed his hands at the industrial sink scrubbing with pumice soap that never quite removed all the evidence of the day's work. His phone buzzed with a payment notification. Rodriguez had transferred the money for the brake job, the transaction arriving before Marcus even had a chance to present the bill. This was the currency of reputation in the neighborhood. People paid promptly because they knew he was honest, and honesty was rare enough to deserve respect. The afternoon was winding down. The garage's clientele, mostly local people, driving cars that were old enough to vote, keeping them running through sheer determination, and mechanics like Marcus, who charged fairly. He could have worked in a dealership, could have pursued certifications that would have allowed him to service high-end vehicles for wealthy clients. But the corporate environment felt like a prison to someone who had spent 15 years operating in the shadows. This garage, with its honest work and simple transactions, was freedom. At 4 o'clock, he locked up the garage and walked Lily to the park, their daily ritual, weather permitting. The playground was crowded with the after-school rush, children burning off energy, while parents watched from benches, typing on phones and talking in clusters. Marcus remained apart from the parent groups, not unfriendly, but clearly unavailable for social connection. He had learned that single fathers occupied an awkward space in the social ecology of playgrounds, suspected by some mothers as predatory, pitied by others as incomplete. Easier to simply focus on Lily and let the rest of the world maintain its distance. She ran to the swings, calling back for him to watch her go high. He pushed her with the measured force of someone who understood physics enough momentum to thrill without risking the catastrophic failure that came from exceeding design tolerances. Every push calculated, every arc controlled. This was how he approached fatherhood, not with the looseness that came naturally to some parents, but with the precision of an engineer ensuring structural integrity. A woman's voice interrupted his focus. "She's fearless. My son won't go higher than 2 feet." Marcus turned to find a mother he recognized from previous park visits, her son playing in the sandbox with intense concentration. She was making conversation, the kind of casual parent interaction he had never quite learned to navigate. His life had been spent in environments where conversation served strategic purposes, where every exchange of information carried weight and consequence. Small talk felt alien. "She trusts the swing. That makes the difference." The woman smiled, apparently satisfied with this response, and returned to watching her son. Marcus resumed pushing Lily, grateful that the interaction had ended without requiring more complexity. This was another reason he preferred the garage to the wider world. Machines were honest in their demands. They broke according to predictable patterns and could be fixed with the right tools and knowledge. People were far more complicated. By the time they returned home, a small 2-bedroom apartment above a Korean grocery 3 blocks from the garage, the sun was setting in shades of orange and red that Lily immediately wanted to capture on paper. Marcus made dinner while she drew the kitchen work, as methodical as anything he did in the garage. Chicken breast, broccoli, brown rice. Nutritionally balanced, nothing fancy. Sarah had been the adventurous cook, capable of creating elaborate meals from whatever ingredients were on hand. Marcus had learned to cook only after she died, teaching himself through the same process he applied to everything: research, practice, systematic improvement. They ate at the small table by the window, Lily narrating her day in the disconnected way that 6-year-olds have, jumping from topic to topic without transition. A classmate who had shared her cookies at lunch, a bug she had seen on the way to the park, a question about whether stars were hot or cold, which led to a 15-minute explanation about nuclear fusion that she absorbed with serious attention. After dinner, after the bath and the toothbrushing and the negotiation about how many books constituted bedtime, Marcus sat on the edge of Lily's bed and read from the current selection a picture book about a rabbit who wanted to fly. The metaphor was not subtle, but Lily loved it, asking him to reread her favorite parts until her eyes grew heavy and her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. He stayed longer than necessary, watching her in the dim glow of the nightlight. She had Sarah's face, her expressions, the way her hands curled when she slept. Every day she looked more like the woman he had lost, and every day that resemblance was both a gift and a wound. He had saved people in situations far more dangerous than a attempted mugging would ever be. He had dismantled networks, stopped attacks, prevented catastrophes that would never appear in any history book. But he had been 7,000 miles away when the person who mattered most had needed saving. The apartment was quiet after Lily's door closed. Marcus moved through his evening routine, checking the locks, setting out tomorrow's clothes, reviewing the next day's schedule of garage appointments. Structure was control, and control was the only protection that mattered. The world was chaos wearing a mask of order, and the only way to survive it was through relentless preparation. At 11 o'clock, his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. "Brake noise getting worse. Can you fit me in tomorrow, AM, willing to pay premium for urgency?" Marcus stared at the message, his pattern recognition instincts triggering on something he couldn't quite name. The phrasing was off, too formal, too businesslike for the neighborhood clientele that usually texted him with things like, "Car making weird sound, can you help?" He typed a careful response. "What vehicle? What kind of noise?" The reply came immediately. 2024 Tesla Model S Plaid. High-pitched whine during regenerative braking, worsening over past week. A Tesla. In his neighborhood, a car worth more than most people on this block earned in 2 years. Marcus's training kicked in the old protocols emerging from muscle memory. Incongruity suggested anomaly. Anomaly suggested threat assessment requirement. But the message could also simply be what it appeared: someone with money who had heard through word of mouth that Marcus fixed things other mechanics couldn't. He texted back, "Garage opens at 7, first come first served." The next morning arrived with the same gray weather rain that had settled in overnight and showed no signs of clearing. Marcus opened the garage at exactly 7, the ritual unchanged, regardless of what the day might bring. The Tesla arrived at 7:15, silent, except for the hiss of expensive tires on wet pavement. The driver who emerged was not what Marcus expected. Eleanor Vance stepped from the vehicle wearing a suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Her expression a mixture of determination and something that looked almost like desperation. She scanned the garage with the assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate environments for threat and opportunity, her eyes lingering on the organized tools, the clean floor, the evidence of professional competence. "I need assistance. My vehicle has malfunctioned." The words were formal, stiff, as if she were addressing a board meeting rather than a mechanic. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and approached his own assessment protocols, engaging automatically. High-value target, expensive vehicle appearing in a low-value neighborhood. Incongruity suggested anomaly. Anomaly suggested. Before he could complete the thought, 3 figures detached from the mouth of the alley across the street. Their movement patterns registered immediately in Marcus's threat assessment matrix: predatory approach vectors, hands in pockets, suggesting concealed weapons, eyes locked on the jewelry at Eleanor's throat, and the watch that probably cost more than the car Rodriguez drove. They had been waiting, watching for exactly this kind of opportunity. Inside the garage office, Lily looked up from her morning drawing, her eyes going wide as she processed the scene. She saw the fear on the strange woman's face, saw the bad men approaching, and her 6-year-old moral universe simplified the situation into absolute clarity. Someone needed help. They were able to help. Therefore, they should help. She tugged on Marcus's jeans, her voice carrying across the garage with the clarity of a bell cutting through fog. "Daddy, can we help her?" The question hung in the humid air, a declaration of principle, so pure and uncomplicated that it made the world's complexity irrelevant. Marcus looked down at his daughter, saw the trust in her eyes, the absolute conviction that her father could fix anything, protect anyone, solve every problem the world presented. She believed in him with a completeness that terrified and sustained him in equal measure. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, the gesture saying everything his voice couldn't in the moment. Then he straightened and stepped forward, placing himself between Eleanor Vance and the approaching threat, his body language shifting in ways that were subtle but profound. The mechanic disappeared. The protector emerged. The three men laughed as they closed the distance, a sound devoid of humor. They saw an easy target, a woman alone with expensive possessions, and a mechanic in greasy overalls who would probably hand over his wallet rather than risk violence. What they didn't see was the weapon-wearing human skin, the 15 years of training compressed into muscle memory, so deep it bypassed conscious thought, the promise made to a 6-year-old girl that no one would ever hurt them again. They saw Marcus Reeves, mechanic and single father. They were about to meet what he had been before the garage, before Lily, before he had chosen peace over violence. They were about to learn that some people don't stop being weapons just because they put down their guns. The first man reached for Eleanor's necklace, his movement telegraphed with the sloppiness of someone who had never faced real resistance. Marcus moved. What happened next would take 14 seconds. To Eleanor, watching from a perspective warped by fear and adrenaline, it would seem to unfold across an impossible stretch of time, each moment crystallizing into perfect clarity, even as the overall sequence blurred into a violence so precise it resembled choreography. To Marcus, it was simply work, a problem requiring solutions solved with the tools he had spent 15 years sharpening. The first attacker's hand never reached Eleanor's necklace. Marcus intercepted the wrist mid-grab, his fingers finding the radial nerve cluster with surgical precision. The pressure point collapsed the man's grip strength to zero, and before the neural signal of pain could travel from periphery to brain, Marcus had already redirected the momentum into a controlled rotation that put the attacker face first against the garage's brick exterior. The impact was measured enough force to stun, not enough to cause permanent damage. The man slid down the wall into unconsciousness, his breathing steady, but his participation in the encounter definitively concluded. The second man registered his companion's defeat with a half-second delay, his brain struggling to process what his eyes had witnessed. He pulled a rust-pitted length of pipe from his jacket, swinging it in a wide arc that betrayed complete absence of training. Marcus didn't retreat or block. He stepped inside the swing's radius where the pipe had no leverage, his left hand catching the attacker's wrist while his right drove a palm heel strike into the exposed solar plexus. The air evacuated from the man's lungs in a sound like a punctured tire. Marcus twisted the captured wrist with calculated torque, and the small bones of the carpus separated with a wet crack that Eleanor would later recall in unwanted dreams. The pipe clattered on concrete. The man followed it down, cradling his ruined wrist and making sounds that weren't quite screams. The third attacker had enough survival instinct to recognize the situation had inverted from predation to prey. He hesitated, his body language shifting from aggression to flight preparation. Marcus closed the distance before the decision could translate to action, moving with economy that eliminated wasted motion. A low sweep removed the man's base gravity, doing the work that force would have required. The attacker's trajectory terminated against the pavement, and Marcus delivered a precise strike to the brachial plexus that shut down the man's nervous system like flipping a circuit breaker. Not permanent, but comprehensive. 14 seconds. 3 threats neutralized. Marcus's breathing hadn't elevated. His hand showed no tremor. He turned back to Eleanor, whose face had cycled through shock into something approaching awe, or possibly terror. The expressions were close enough that distinguishing between them required more attention than Marcus was willing to spare. "Are you all right, ma'am?" The formality of the address created cognitive dissonance with the violence that had preceded it. Eleanor managed to nod, her throat too constricted for speech. She had witnessed boardroom warfare, hostile takeovers, corporate destruction delivered with politeness and paperwork, but this raw physical dominance executed with the precision of an algorithm existed outside her reference framework entirely. Marcus was already shifting focus to the Tesla walking its perimeter with diagnostic attention. He crouched near the rear wheel well, his ear tilted as if listening to frequencies beyond normal human range. Eleanor watched him work her executive brain, attempting to categorize what she had just witnessed. The mechanics of the fight replayed in her memory, each movement revealing itself as impossibly efficient. No wasted energy, no excess force, no emotional content whatsoever. It was violence as pure function, and the perfection of it was somehow more disturbing than if he had simply beaten the men unconscious. Your regenerative braking system has a feedback oscillation in the inverter circuit. The controller's trying to compensate for a voltage discrepancy that doesn't actually exist, creating a harmonic that manifests as the whine you're hearing. It's a firmware issue, not hardware. The next over-the-air update should patch it, but until then, you can minimize it by reducing the regenerative braking intensity in your vehicle settings. He delivered this diagnosis without looking up, his hands tracing the undercarriage as if reading Braille. Then he stood wiping his hands on the rag that seemed permanently attached to his person. That'll be $75 for the diagnostic. The amount was so absurd given the context that Eleanor almost laughed. This man had just dismantled 3 attackers with the efficiency of industrial machinery, diagnosed a malfunction in a vehicle that cost more than most houses, and was charging less than her morning coffee budget. The incongruity suggested either profound humility or complete disconnection from normal economic reality. She pulled cash from her wallet, hundreds, because she hadn't carried smaller denominations in years, and handed him 2 bills. Keep the change, and thank you for everything. Marcus accepted the money with a slight nod, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude. Behind him, Lily had emerged from the garage office, her small face solemn as she surveyed the 3 men beginning to stir on the pavement. She walked over to Eleanor with the kind of fearless curiosity that children possess before the world teaches them to be afraid. "Are you okay? You look scared." The simple concern, delivered without agenda or expectation, cracked something in Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. "I am now. Thanks to your dad." Lily beamed with pride, then returned to the office where her drawing awaited completion. Eleanor climbed back into the Tesla, her hands shaking slightly as they gripped the wheel. In the rearview mirror, she watched Marcus on his phone, presumably calling police to collect the 3 men who were now attempting to crawl away from the garage. His face showed no satisfaction, no triumph, just the bland neutrality of someone who had completed a routine task. The drive back to Vance Dynamics headquarters passed in a blur of thought rather than scenery. Eleanor's mind was already shifting into the mode that had built her empire when presented with an asset of exceptional value. Acquire it. Marcus represented capabilities she didn't fully understand, but immediately recognized as valuable. The speed of his response, the precision of his actions, the complete absence of hesitation, these were not traits cultivated by changing oil and replacing brake pads. By the time she reached her office, she had made a decision. Her assistant looked up from her desk with practiced deference. "Get me everything we can find on Marcus Reeves. Age approximately 40 to 45, operates an automotive repair garage in the industrial district on 7th Avenue. I want background, employment history, military records if applicable. Use Richard Moss if you need to access restricted databases. I want the report by end of business today." The assistant's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only indication of surprise she would permit herself. "Understood, Ms. Vance. Anything else?" "Clear my calendar for tomorrow morning. I'll be making an external site visit." The rest of the day evaporated into crisis management as analysts dissected the latest Aegis failure and competitors circled with the patience of carrion birds. But Eleanor's attention kept returning to the garage, to the man who had moved like violence incarnate and spoken like a librarian to the daughter who had asked the simplest and most profound question Eleanor had heard in years. "Can we help her?" The report arrived at 6:30, delivered by Moss himself rather than through digital channels. His expression communicated that what he was about to share required context that email couldn't provide. "Your mechanic is considerably more than he appears." Moss laid out the file, heavily redacted military service records, commendations for operations that had no official names, discharge papers listing specializations in fields Eleanor recognized from defense contracts she had pursued: combat engineering, asymmetrical warfare, advanced systems integration. The language was bureaucratic, but the implications were clear. Marcus Reeves had been a weapon, and a particularly sophisticated one. There's more. He holds 7 patents, all of them classified under national security provisions. Drone guidance systems, advanced composites, electronic warfare countermeasures. The kind of work that suggests he wasn't just boots on the ground, he was designing the boots and the ground both. Eleanor studied a photograph from his service record, younger but unmistakably the same man. The eyes held the same flat calm she had witnessed that morning, the expression of someone who had seen enough of the world's violence to no longer be surprised by any of it. Why is someone with this background fixing cars in the industrial district? Moss flipped to another page. His wife died 3 years ago. Traffic accident. He was deployed when it happened, didn't make it back for the funeral. Put in for discharge immediately after, despite being offered positions that would have kept him stateside. He just walked away from everything. The narrative assembled itself in Eleanor's mind with the clarity of a balance sheet. Grief, guilt, the choice to prioritize his daughter over a career that had taken everything else from him. It was a story she understood intellectually while finding it emotionally alien. She had never walked away from anything in her life. Every setback had been fuel for the next advancement, every loss transformed into motivation. The idea of simply quitting, of choosing simplicity over achievement, felt like admitting defeat. But the capabilities Marcus possessed were exactly what she needed. Not just protection, she could hire protection from any number of corporate security firms. What she needed was someone who could think in dimensions her competitors couldn't access, who could see threats before they materialized, who operated according to rules that existed outside the normal boundaries of corporate warfare. Thank you, Richard. This stays between us. She spent the evening crafting her pitch, running through arguments and counter-arguments, the way she prepared for investor meetings. By the time she fell into bed sometime after midnight, she had constructed what felt like an irrefutable case for why Marcus should accept the position she was about to offer. The next morning arrived with October sunlight that felt borrowed from summer, warm enough to convince the city that autumn might reconsider its arrival. Eleanor drove the Tesla herself rather than using her driver retracing the route to the garage. She had dressed differently today, still professional, but softer somehow, as if acknowledging that the battlefield had changed and required different armor. Marcus was already at work when she arrived, his upper body buried in the engine compartment of a decades-old pickup truck. He emerged at the sound of her approach, wiping hands on the eternal rag, and regarding her with an expression that suggested he had been expecting this visit. The firmware issue settled down on my arm. It's fine, but that's not why I'm here. Eleanor had delivered high-stakes pitches to Pentagon procurement officers, to venture capitalists whose time was measured in millions per hour, to boards of directors who could end her career with a vote. But something about this conversation felt different, the stakes personal rather than professional. I want to offer you a position, head of personal security for Vance Dynamics, with a focus on protecting critical projects and personnel. Salary to be negotiated, but I'm prepared to start at $300,000 annually plus equity and benefits. Marcus listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When she finished, he set down the wrench he had been holding and met her eyes with a directness that felt almost intrusive. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I'm not for sale. I have everything I need right here. He gestured toward the garage office where Lily sat visible through the window, her head bent over another drawing. The gesture was simple but absolute. This is my world, and your money cannot improve it. Eleanor felt the refusal like a physical blow. She was accustomed to rejection in business, the normal friction of negotiation. But this was different. Marcus wasn't negotiating. He was simply declining to engage with the entire framework of her offer. Money didn't matter. Status didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was visible through that window, bent over crayons and construction paper. Before she could formulate a response, Lily appeared at her father's side holding something in both hands, with the solemnity of a sacred offering. The bluebird drawing, now complete, flying through a yellow sky that somehow suggested hope, despite being rendered in a 6-year-old's approximation of perspective. For you, so you won't be sick. The words detonated something in Eleanor's carefully maintained defenses. This child who had nothing was offering the only thing she had to give her art. Her time, her concern to a stranger who possessed everything money could buy. The generosity was so pure, so completely free of calculation, that Eleanor felt her throat constrict with emotions she had spent 2 decades learning to suppress. Thank you, it's beautiful. She accepted the drawing with a care that surprised herself, holding it as if it were constructed from something more fragile than paper. Lily beamed satisfied that her gift had been properly received and returned to the office to begin her next creation. Marcus watched this exchange with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite parse. Then he spoke with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the mechanical efficiency of his earlier violence. She has her mother's heart, sees suffering, and wants to fix it. The opening felt deliberate, an invitation to vulnerability that Eleanor recognized even as she struggled with how to respond. In her world, vulnerability was leverage waiting to be exploited. But Marcus's world apparently operated on different principles. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything other than sad, or at least anything other than driven. They might be the same thing. The confession emerged without her permission, bypassing the executive function that normally censored such admissions. Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense. The highest walls don't keep threats out. They just lock you in. The words landed with the weight of lived experience rather than philosophical abstraction. Eleanor recognized the voice of someone who had built his own walls and learned their cost. She found herself speaking truths she had never articulated, not even to herself. It's not just personal security. My company is in trouble. We're developing a drone defense system called Aegis, and it's failing. Every test ends in catastrophic failure. The simulations are perfect, but in the field they just fall from the sky. Someone is sabotaging the project from the inside. My fiancé, Julian Croft, is the project lead. The admission felt like surrender, exposing weakness to someone who had already demonstrated capacity for violence. But Eleanor's instincts, the same instincts that had built a 9-figure company from a 2-person startup, were screaming that this man could be trusted in ways that the people in her own boardroom could not. Marcus's expression shifted fractionally, calculation replacing the earlier gentleness. Let me see the schematics. And they moved into the garage office, which suddenly felt smaller with 2 adults occupying space designed for a child and her father. Eleanor pulled a tablet from her bag secured with encryption that would take most hackers months to crack and loaded the Aegis blueprints. Millions of dollars of proprietary research rendered in lines and code that represented the future of autonomous warfare. Marcus studied the screen with an intensity Eleanor recognized from watching her best engineers work. But his focus was different, not the narrow concentration of a specialist, but the broad synthesis of someone trained to see systems rather than components. His fingers moved across the display, zooming into specific sections, cross-referencing subsystems, building a mental map of the entire architecture. 15 minutes passed in silence. Eleanor watched him work, noting the way his eyes tracked across the code with the fluency of a native speaker. This was not a mechanic who had picked up basic programming. This was someone who thought in multiple languages, simultaneously mechanical, digital, tactical. Finally, he stopped on a specific block of code buried deep in the navigation firmware. His finger tapped the screen. There, it's elegant. Brilliant even. What is it? A logic bomb nested inside a false diagnostic routine. On the ground, it reports all systems normal. But once the drone reaches a specific altitude and airspeed, it triggers a cascade failure in the flight stabilizers. Whoever wrote this designed it to be untraceable, to look like hardware malfunction. Eleanor felt ice crystallizing in her chest. Proof of sabotage was somehow worse than suspicion had been. Suspicion allowed for alternative explanations for the possibility that she was wrong. Proof eliminated ambiguity, and with it any remaining hope that Julian might be innocent. Can you trace who wrote it? Marcus was already working, diving deeper into the code's metadata. But after several minutes, he leaned back with the frustrated expression of someone who had hit a dead end. The code's been laundered through enough false flags and proxy servers that direct attribution is impossible. But the signature is military grade. Special operations cyber warfare unit probably. The kind of people who make intrusions look like accidents. The description aligned too perfectly with Moss's preliminary findings about Julian's encrypted communications. Eleanor pulled out her phone and showed Marcus the financial records, offshore accounts, wire transfer, the digital breadcrumbs of someone hiding something. This is Julian, my fiancé, the man who should be helping me save this company. Marcus studied the data with the same methodical attention he had given the code. When he looked up, his eyes held something that might have been sympathy. The question isn't whether he's involved. The question is whether he's running the operation or just taking orders. These transfers are too clean, too professional. He's either exceptionally good at tradecraft or someone is setting him up to look guilty. The possibility that Julian might be a victim rather than a perpetrator should have offered comfort. Instead, it's just added layers of complexity to a situation already spiraling beyond Eleanor's control. Either her fiancé was betraying her or someone was framing him while betraying her. Neither option suggested a path forward that didn't end in ruins. The final demonstration is in 12 days. If Aegis fails again, the Pentagon pulls the contract and Vance Dynamics is finished. I need to know who's behind this, and I need to stop them. Marcus returned his attention to the tablet, his fingers moving across the code with increasing speed. He was building something Eleanor realized, not just analyzing the sabotage, but constructing a counter to it. You can't stop the attack without revealing that you know it's coming. And if they know you know, they'll just change tactics. What you need is to let the attack happen, but control it. Turn their weapon back on them. The strategy was pure asymmetric warfare, accepting apparent defeat in order to secure actual victory. Eleanor understood the logic intellectually, but emotionally it felt like jumping off a cliff while trusting that someone had installed a safety net she couldn't see. How? I write a patch that doesn't fix the logic bomb, it redirects it. When they send the kill signal, the patch catches it and uses the signal itself as a tracer. Real-time mapping of its origin displayed for everyone to see. They set the trap, but we control when it springs and who it catches. The elegance of the solution was almost beautiful, a perfect inversion of the original sabotage. Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months, hope tentative and fragile but undeniably present. Will it work? If I write it correctly, yes. If there are variables I haven't accounted for, then no. But that's true of any operation. You calculate risk, you minimize variables, and then you execute. He spoke like someone reciting doctrine principles so deeply embedded, they had become reflexive. Eleanor recognized the mindset. It was how she approached business, how she had always approached everything. The difference was that Marcus had applied these principles in contexts where failure meant death rather than bankruptcy. Why are you helping me? You turned down the job. Marcus glanced toward the window where Lily sat, her small form silhouetted against morning light. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that suggested he was answering a question deeper than the one Eleanor had asked. My daughter asked if we could help you. I told her we could. That makes it a promise, and I don't break promises to my daughter. Not anymore. The final two words carried grief so compressed it had achieved the density of diamond. Eleanor understood she was witnessing the edge of a story she would never fully hear, a history that had shaped this man into something simultaneously more and less than human. They worked through the morning, Marcus building the countermeasure, while Eleanor handled the cascade of business that continued regardless of personal crisis. Stock analysts wanted statements about Aegis. Investors wanted assurances. Board members wanted explanations. She delivered all of it with the smooth competence of someone who had learned to project confidence even while standing on crumbling ground. Around noon, Lily appeared with sandwiches she had assembled herself, peanut butter and jelly, cut into precise triangles presented on paper plates, with the pride of a chef unveiling a masterpiece. Eleanor accepted hers with genuine gratitude, and they ate in companionable silence, broken only by Lily's narration of the complex backstory she had created for her Bluebird character. Marcus listened with complete attention, asking questions that took the storytelling seriously rather than condescending to childhood imagination. Eleanor watched the interaction and felt something shift in her understanding. This was what she had sacrificed in her climb to success, the capacity for presence, for being fully in a moment rather than constantly calculating 3 moves ahead. Marcus had walked away from power to reclaim this. She had never considered that the trade might go in that direction. By mid-afternoon, Marcus had completed the initial version of the countermeasure. The code was compact, efficient, elegant in the way that good writing is elegant, every element serving purpose, nothing extraneous. He walked Eleanor through the logic, explaining how the patch would intercept the sabotage signal and transform it into a beacon. It will work, but you need to understand the risk. If they're watching for countermeasures, if they've built in fail-safes, I haven't anticipated the whole thing could backfire. The demonstration could fail anyway, and you'll have revealed that you knew about the sabotage. Eleanor considered the variables, running probability calculations based on incomplete information. It was the kind of decision that had defined her career: significant downside, potentially transformative, upside, no middle ground. She made it the way she made all such decisions: quickly, decisively, without second guessing. We proceed. I'll have Peterson integrate the patch into tomorrow's build mast as routine optimization. No one will know except you and me. Marcus nodded, accepting this. Then he surprised her by asking a question that had nothing to do with code or sabotage. The man you're engaged to, do you love him? The directness was jarring, socially inappropriate, in ways that should have triggered Eleanor's defensive protocols. Instead, she found herself considering the question, seriously examining her feelings with the honesty she normally reserved for financial statements. I don't know, I thought I did, but I'm starting to realize I might not know what love actually looks like. I know what partnership looks like, what strategic alignment looks like, what compatible ambitions look like. But love, that might be something different. Marcus's expression suggested he understood exactly what she meant. My wife used to say that love was choosing someone's well-being over your own comfort. Not grand gestures or big moments, just 1,000 small decisions to put someone else first. The past tense hung heavy between them. Eleanor recognized an opening, an invitation to reciprocate vulnerability. What happened to her? Traffic accident. A semi's brakes failed. I was deployed, couldn't get back in time. By the time they flew me home, she was already buried. I missed everything that mattered. The confession was delivered in the same flat tone Marcus used for mechanical diagnoses, as if emotion had been deliberately compressed into manageability. But Eleanor heard the anguish underneath the wound that had never fully healed, because healing would mean letting go. Is that why you left the military? I left because continuing would have meant choosing the work over Lily. And I'd already made that choice once with Sarah. I couldn't make it again. The logic was simple, the sacrifice enormous. Eleanor tried to imagine walking away from Vance Dynamics, from everything she had built, and found the concept incomprehensible. Her company wasn't just her livelihood, it was her identity, her proof of worth, her justification for existence. Without it, she wasn't sure who she would be. They spent the rest of the afternoon refining the countermeasure, testing it against simulated attack vectors, identifying potential failure modes. Marcus worked with the systematic thoroughness of someone for whom mistakes meant consequences beyond embarrassment. Eleanor matched his intensity, recognizing a kindred spirit despite their vastly different domains. As evening approached and Lily began showing signs of restlessness, Eleanor prepared to leave. She paused at the garage door, the bluebird drawing carefully stored in her bag. Thank you. For the help, for the honesty, for the... She struggled for the right word. For seeing me, I think. Marcus offered a small smile, the first she had witnessed from him. Sometimes the people who look the strongest are the ones most in need of help. They just can't admit it. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Eleanor drove back to the city with those words circling in her mind, competing with strategic calculations about implementation timelines and risk matrices. By the time she reached her apartment, she had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She called Julian, her voice carefully neutral. We need to talk. Tonight. He arrived an hour later, bringing wine she didn't want and conversations she couldn't focus on. They sat in her living room that felt like a hotel lobby, and Eleanor studied his face with fresh eyes. Was this the face of a traitor or a patsy, or simply someone caught in currents beyond his control? I know about the offshore accounts, Julian. I know about the encrypted communications. I know you've been hiding something. His expression cycled through denial. Anger, resignation, landing finally on a kind of defeated honesty she had never seen from him before. It's not what you think, Elle. I swear to you, I haven't betrayed the company. The accounts, the communications, they're all part of something else. Something I can't explain without putting people at risk. The vagueness was either the truth or an exceptionally good lie. Eleanor no longer trusted her ability to distinguish between them. She held his gaze, searching for certainty and finding only more questions. I want to believe you, but belief isn't enough anymore. In 12 days, everything I've built either survives or collapses. I need to know whose side you're on. Julian reached for her hand and she let him take it, feeling the touch without any corresponding emotional response. I'm on your side. I've always been on your side. You just need to trust me. Trust. The word felt like a foreign concept, something from a language Eleanor had never quite learned to speak fluently. She looked at the man she was supposed to marry and realized she had no idea who he actually was beneath the surface they both maintained. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he was lying. Maybe truth and lies were the wrong framework entirely. She withdrew her hand gently, the gesture carrying finality without hostility. I'll give you 12 days to prove it. After the demonstration, we'll know where we stand. Julian left without the wine he had brought, and Eleanor stood at her window watching the city lights blur into abstract patterns. Somewhere out there, Marcus was putting Lily to bed, reading stories about rabbits who wanted to fly. Somewhere out there, the people sabotaging Aegis were preparing their next move. Somewhere out there, her future was being decided by forces she could barely perceive, much less control. She pulled out her phone and sent Marcus a text. The patch is integrated. Now we wait. His response came immediately. Waiting is the hardest part, but it's also where battles are won or lost in the preparation, not the action. Eleanor set down the phone and allowed herself for the first time in years to acknowledge the full weight of her exhaustion. Not the physical fatigue that sleep could fix, but the deeper weariness of someone who had been holding up walls for so long, they had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without the constant pressure of structural responsibility. 12 days until everything changed. 12 days to discover whether she had found an ally or simply exposed her throat to another predator. 12 days to learn whether trust was wisdom or suicide. Outside her window, the city breathed its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the personal catastrophes being lived out in its towers and tunnels. Eleanor watched the lights and thought about bluebirds flying through yellow skies, about daughters who asked if they could help, about fathers who kept promises no matter the cost. She thought about walls and what they protected and what they prevented, and whether there might be a third option. She had never considered that true strength might lie not in the fortress, but in the courage to leave it. The 12 days compressed into a series of moments that felt simultaneously endless and instantaneous. Eleanor found herself driving to the garage more frequently than professional necessity demanded, ostensibly to review the countermeasure integration, but actually seeking the strange sanctuary that Marcus's workshop provided. The space operated according to rules that made sense: break something, fix it, charge what the work costs. No hidden agendas, no corporate maneuvering, just the honest transaction between problem and solution. Marcus worked on the digital mousetrap with the same methodical precision he applied to brake repairs, treating billion-dollar sabotage with identical seriousness to a misfiring engine. Eleanor watched him refine the code across multiple iterations, each version tightening the trap while reducing the probability of detection. He explained his reasoning in terms she recognized from her own engineering background: redundancy, fail-safes, graceful degradation. The trap has 3 layers. First layer catches the signal and maps its origin. Second layer neutralizes the payload before it reaches the flight controllers. Third layer, this is the crucial part, mimics just enough instability to make them think the attack is working, keeps them engaged long enough for the trace to complete. Eleanor absorbed the logic, recognizing the psychological sophistication embedded in the technical architecture. You're not just catching them, you're making them watch their own failure. Justice should have witnesses, especially when the crime was designed to be invisible. The statement carried weight beyond its immediate context. Eleanor found herself wondering how many invisible crimes Marcus had witnessed in his previous life, how many injustices he had been ordered to ignore or participate in. The man who fixed cars and made sandwiches for his daughter had seen things that would break most people. The fact that he remained gentle with Lily, patient with the customers, measured in his responses, that spoke to a strength Eleanor was only beginning to comprehend. Their working sessions developed a rhythm. Eleanor would arrive mid-morning after handling the urgent fires that erupted daily as Aegis's demonstration approached. Marcus would have coffee ready, not the artisanal single-origin nonsense her office served, but honest drip coffee in a mug advertising a parts supplier. They would review overnight developments, adjust variables, run simulations. Lily would work on her drawings nearby, occasionally interrupting with observations that possessed unexpected wisdom. Why does the bad code want to hurt the flying machine? Eleanor had frozen at that question, unsure how to explain industrial sabotage to a 6-year-old. Marcus had answered without hesitation. Because some people measure their success by other people's failure. They can't build something good themselves, so they try to destroy what others build. Lily had considered this seriously, then returned to her artwork with the pronouncement that those people were silly and should try coloring instead, which worked much better for making things. Eleanor had laughed for the first time in weeks, the sound surprising her with its unfamiliarity. The nights were harder. Eleanor would return to her apartment where Julian waited with increasing frequency, his presence feeling more like surveillance than companionship. He asked questions about her days with casual interest that felt rehearsed, his eyes tracking her responses, with attention that suggested he was looking for something specific. She had become adept at constructing explanations that were technically truthful, while revealing nothing, yet she was working on the system optimizations. No, nothing major had changed in the codebase. The demonstration remained on schedule. Richard Moss delivered updates that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Julian's encrypted communications had intensified as the demonstration approached. Wire transfers to the offshore accounts had accelerated. Most damning, his movement patterns showed him visiting locations that had no obvious connection to either Vance Dynamics or his supposed side business. He was meeting someone and taking extraordinary precautions to ensure those meetings remained undetected. "We could bring in federal authorities now," Moss suggested during one late-night briefing. "The evidence is circumstantial but substantial. At minimum, we could get a warrant for electronic surveillance." Eleanor had considered this path and rejected it. "If we move too early and he's the architect, his partners scatter, and we never find them all. If we move too early and he's just a pawn, we tip our hand to the actual players. We wait for the demonstration. We let them commit fully. Then we destroy them publicly." The strategy was high-risk gambling, everything on a single moment. But Eleanor had built her career on calculated gambles, and Marcus had designed a trap that transformed astronomical risk into acceptable probability. She trusted the mathematics, and more surprisingly, she was learning to trust the man behind them. 5 days before the demonstration, Marcus asked her to stay after their usual session. Lily had fallen asleep on the office couch, her small form curled around a stuffed rabbit, worn soft by years of love. He spoke quietly to avoid waking her. "I need to be there, at the demonstration, in position to manually intervene if the countermeasure fails, or if they've built in contingencies I haven't anticipated." Eleanor had expected this request. "I can arrange credentials, get you into the facility as a consultant." "No, credentials mean databases, security footage, digital footprints. If this goes wrong, I can't have my presence creating complications for you or Lily. I need to be there invisibly." The implication was clear: he would infiltrate the demonstration using skills that had nothing to do with automotive repair. Eleanor should have objected on numerous legal and ethical grounds. Instead, she simply asked what he needed. "Building schematics, security rotations, list of attendees with photos, and a vehicle I can stage nearby, something with enough space for equipment." And for Lily, Marcus glanced at his sleeping daughter, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to name. "She comes with me. I won't leave her, and I won't put her at risk by having her somewhere I can't immediately reach. She stays in the vehicle occupied and safe while I work." The decision violated every principle of child safety Eleanor understood and simultaneously made perfect sense. Marcus knew threats Eleanor couldn't imagine had survived situations that existed outside civilian comprehension. If he said Lily was safer with him than anywhere else, Eleanor believed him. The next 3 days were consumed by preparation that felt like planning a military operation rather than a corporate demonstration. Marcus studied the building schematics with the intensity of someone memorizing terrain for insertion. Eleanor provided security rotations, access codes, contingency plans. They communicated through encrypted channels that Marcus had set up military-grade protocols that made her corporate security look like children's toys. Julian grew more agitated as the demonstration approached, his usually perfect composure showing cracks. He snapped at subordinates, changed the presentation order multiple times, insisted on reviewing systems that had already been tested to exhaustion. Eleanor watched him unravel and felt something that might have been sympathy if it weren't overwhelmed by suspicion. Either he was nervous because his sabotage might be discovered, or nervous because he knew sabotage was coming and couldn't stop it. Both possibilities ended badly. The night before the demonstration, Julian appeared at her apartment unannounced. He looked haggard, his expensive suit rumpled in ways that suggested he had been wearing it for days. When he spoke, his voice carried desperation she had never heard from him. "Elle, I need you to trust me one more time. Tomorrow, no matter what happens, remember that I love you, that everything I've done has been to protect you." The words should have offered comfort. Instead, they triggered every alarm Eleanor possessed. People who needed to assert their love were usually about to betray it. People who claimed protection were usually justifying control. She wanted to demand explanations to force clarity from ambiguity, but doing so might reveal that she knew more than she was supposed to, might tip the balance at the worst possible moment. "I'll remember. Get some rest, Julian. Tomorrow matters." After he left, Eleanor stood at her window and sent Marcus a message. "He knows something, or suspects something. We need to be ready for variables." The response came within seconds. "Variables are constants in a different form. We adapt." The morning of the demonstration arrived with the October cold that felt borrowed from deeper winter. Eleanor dressed in armor disguised as clothing, a suit that communicated authority, heels that added height without sacrificing stability, jewelry minimal enough to avoid distraction. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone preparing for battle, which was accurate enough. The exhibition hall was a cathedral of corporate power, its vast space designed to make human beings feel appropriately insignificant. Rows of seats ascending in tiers, massive screens flanking a stage where the Aegis drone sat like a sculpture, celebrating humanity's conquest of physics. Military brass occupied the front rows, their uniforms and ribbons, a language Eleanor had learned to read. These were people who made decisions measured in billions, in consequences measured in lives. Pentagon procurement officers clustered near the stage, their expressions professionally neutral, in ways that communicated intense scrutiny. Competitors occupied the middle sections present to witness either Vance Dynamics' triumph or its destruction with equal satisfaction. Press lined the back cameras, ready to document whichever narrative emerged. Eleanor found her position backstage reviewing notes she had memorized days ago. Julian was there running through final systems checks with an attention to detail that seemed excessive even for him. Their eyes met across the controlled chaos, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, that they had reached an inflection point from which there would be no return to previous arrangements. The presentation began with the orchestrated precision of theater. Peterson delivered technical specifications to an audience that understood perhaps 20% of what they were hearing, but nodded as if it all made perfect sense. Video reels showed previous test successes carefully edited to exclude the catastrophic failures that had preceded this moment. Eleanor watched from the wings and thought about bluebirds and yellow skies, about daughters who asked if they could help, about walls and what they cost. 6 blocks away, Marcus sat in an unmarked van parked in an alley with sightlines to the exhibition hall's roof access. The vehicle's interior had been transformed into a mobile operations center laptop running monitoring software, radio scanner tracking security frequencies, equipment that looked simultaneously mundane and ominous. Lily occupied the passenger seat with her coloring books, a tablet loaded with educational games, snacks portioned into containers designed to minimize mess. "Daddy, why are we in the special car instead of the garage?" Marcus finished calibrating his equipment before answering, giving her question the respect it deserved. "I'm helping Miss Eleanor with something important. Sometimes helping means being ready in case things go wrong." "Are things going to go wrong?" "I hope not, but hoping isn't the same as planning." Lily accepted this logic and returned to her drawing, a scene of the van with both of them inside surrounded by protective symbols. She had invented a child's attempt to impose order on situations she couldn't fully understand. Marcus watched her work for a moment, memorizing the scene against the possibility that today might complicate their uncomplicated life. His phone vibrated with Eleanor's message. "Presentation beginning. Aegis launch in 15 minutes. Marcus pulled up the monitoring software, multiple windows showing data streams from the drone's onboard systems. Everything reported nominal, which meant either the sabotage was exceptionally well hidden or his countermeasure had already neutralized preliminary probes. He watched code scroll past in real time, looking for the signature he had identified in Eleanor's garage, the elegant logic bomb that was simultaneously its creator's masterpiece and epitaph. Inside the exhibition hall, Eleanor took the stage as Peterson completed the technical briefing. She had delivered hundreds of presentations, could recite quarterly earnings while mentally planning dinner. But this felt different, each word weighted with consequences that extended beyond stock prices. The Aegis represents more than technological achievement. It represents a commitment to protecting those who protect us, to ensuring that American forces have tools that match their courage. Today, we demonstrate not just what Aegis can do, but what American innovation can accomplish when vision meets execution. The words were calculated to appeal to the nationalism and budget priorities of her Pentagon audience. But Eleanor was thinking about a mechanic who had walked away from exactly this world, who had chosen a daughter and honest work over the seductive complexity of systems designed for destruction. She wondered what he would think of this speech, whether he would hear the hollowness beneath the soaring rhetoric. Julian stood at the control station, his hands moving across interfaces with practiced efficiency. Eleanor watched him input the launch sequence and saw his fingers hesitate fractionally over the final confirmation. The hesitation lasted perhaps half a second, invisible to anyone not looking for it. But Eleanor was looking, and she saw doubt or fear or guilt flash across his face before professionalism reclaimed it. The Aegis lifted off with the near silence that made electric propulsion so unsettling, a machine of considerable power announcing itself only through the whisper of rotors displacing air. It climbed in a perfect trajectory, its flight path displayed on the massive screens in numbers and graphs that told the audience everything except what actually mattered. The military observers leaned forward slightly, the unconscious body language of people watching something they wanted to succeed because their budgets depended on it. In the van, Marcus's screen erupted with activity. The logic bomb had just activated, sending its kill signal to the drone's flight stabilizers. But the countermeasure intercepted it, capturing the signal like a specimen for examination. Data flooded across the display: source, address, routing path, authentication credentials. The trap had sprung and something large was caught in it. Marcus initiated the trace protocol, watching as the software followed the signal backward through its deliberately obscured path. Each proxy server revealed itself under sustained analysis, the digital breadcrumbs leading inevitably toward their origin. On the main screen, a map of the exhibition hall materialized, and a red line began drawing itself from the router toward a specific location in the VIP section. He photographed the screen and sent the image to Eleanor with a single word: confirmed. Eleanor felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, but couldn't check it without breaking the presentation's flow. On the screens, the Aegis had reached 800 feet, the altitude where previous tests had failed catastrophically. The audience collectively held breath, everyone in the room aware that this was the threshold between success and disaster. Eleanor kept her expression neutral while her mind raced through scenarios, calculating probabilities and preparing responses. The drone continued climbing. 850 feet, 900. Smooth and stable, its systems reporting nominal function across all parameters. A murmur rippled through the audience, surprise mixing with relief and the beginning of approval. Eleanor allowed herself a fraction of relaxation, then caught Julian's expression in her peripheral vision. He was staring at his control station with confusion verging on panic. His fingers moved rapidly across the interface, inputting commands that should have triggered the catastrophic failure he had been promised or feared, depending on which version of his story was true. But the Aegis ignored these commands, continuing its demonstration flight with mechanical indifference to human intention. The screens flanking the stage suddenly divided the drone's feed-sharing space with something new. A map appeared showing the exhibition hall in wireframe precision. A red line was tracing itself across this map, with the inevitability of a verdict being read in court. The audience's murmur intensified to confuse conversation as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. Eleanor stepped to the microphone, her voice cutting through the rising chaos, with the authority of someone who had anticipated this exact moment. It appears we have identified a security anomaly in our systems. As you can see on the display, an unauthorized signal was transmitted to the Aegis flight controller approximately 90 seconds ago. Our countermeasures intercepted and traced this signal to its point of origin. The red line completed its journey, terminating on a specific seat in the VIP section, where Julian Croft sat frozen, his face cycling through expressions too rapidly for coherent emotion. Every camera in the hall swiveled toward him, every eye following the accusatory line that connected him to attempted sabotage broadcast in real time to an audience that included federal law enforcement. Julian stood abruptly, his mouth opening to protest or explain or deny. But before sound could emerge, two men in suits that communicated federal authority moved with practiced efficiency to bracket him. One spoke quietly while the other took a position that prevented flight. Julian's shoulders sagged, the last air escaping from a balloon that had been sustaining itself through pressure rather than substance. Eleanor continued as if choreographed interruptions were standard in product demonstrations. Vance Dynamics takes security extremely seriously. All evidence has been preserved and will be provided to appropriate authorities. The Aegis performed flawlessly despite this attempted interference, demonstrating not only our technical capabilities, but our commitment to protecting our systems from those who would undermine American defense readiness. She was improvising now, transforming crisis into marketing opportunity with the ruthlessness that had built her company. The Pentagon observers were nodding, less interested in the personal drama than the fact that Aegis had survived a legitimate attack. Competitors looked stricken, realizing that Vance had just demonstrated both technical superiority and counterintelligence capability. Press were transcribing frantically, recognizing they were witnessing a story that would dominate industry coverage for months. The Aegis completed its demonstration flight and returned to its launch platform with textbook precision. Eleanor remained at the microphone, fielding questions, projecting calm competence, while her interior landscape resembled a city after earthquake, structures still standing, but foundations fundamentally altered. In the van, Marcus watched federal agents escort Julian from the building through a service entrance. His path tracked by security cameras, Marcus had access through methods that would remain professionally unmentioned. He verified that the trace data had been transmitted to law enforcement through channels that would never connect back to Eleanor or himself. The operation was complete, the trap sprung, the saboteur captured with evidence so overwhelming that denial became irrelevant. Lily looked up from her drawing, sensing the shift in her father's attention. "Did you help Miss Eleanor?" "I think so. Sometimes helping means catching the person who is hurting so they can't hurt anymore. Like putting a Band-Aid on the bad." The metaphor was imperfect, but captured something essential. Marcus smiled despite the adrenaline still processing through his system. "Exactly like that." He drove them back to the garage, Lily narrating the adventure of sitting in the special car, transforming surveillance into story through the alchemy that children possess. Marcus let her talk, anchoring himself in her voice and the ordinary world it represented. By the time they reached the garage, the exhibition hall felt like something from a different life, a brief incursion of his past into their carefully constructed present. Eleanor remained at the hall for 2 hours, managing the aftermath with precision that bordered on surgical. Statements to press, assurances to Pentagon observers, coordination with federal investigators who wanted to understand how Vance had detected and traced the sabotage. She provided technical details while obscuring Marcus's involvement, framing the countermeasure as the work of her internal security team. Moss backed this narrative with the smooth confidence of someone trained in plausible cover stories. By the time she extracted herself, evening had fallen and exhaustion had progressed beyond physical into something approaching spiritual. She drove to the garage on autopilot, her conscious mind occupied with processing implications while her body executed the familiar route. The roll-up door was closed but unlocked, Marcus's signal that she was expected. Inside, he was cleaning tools with the meditative focus of someone using physical routine to process complex events. Lily was asleep in the office, her small form covered by a blanket decorated with cartoon birds. Marcus looked up as Eleanor entered, his expression asking questions his voice didn't need to articulate. "They arrested him. Federal charges, probably espionage, if the investigation connects to the foreign intelligence contacts Moss identified. His lawyer is claiming entrapment, but the evidence is overwhelming." "Do you feel relieved or something else?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. "I feel like I should feel more than I do. He was my fiancé. I was supposed to marry him. But mostly I just feel tired and angry that I wasted time on someone who saw me as leverage rather than a person." Marcus set down the wrench he had been cleaning, giving her his full attention. "People like Julian, they see the world as resources to be optimized. You were valuable, so he positioned himself to extract that value. It's not personal, that's what makes it so completely personal." The observation was precise enough to hurt. Eleanor had spent 2 years with someone who loved what she represented more than who she was. The distinction seemed obvious in retrospect, but hindsight possessed clarity that real-time experience lacked. How did you learn to see through people so clearly? Survival, when deception gets people killed, you develop antibodies to it. But there's a cost. You start seeing threats everywhere, start trusting nothing. It's why I left. I didn't want Lily growing up with a father who saw the world through crosshairs. They stood in silence, broken only by the garage's ambient sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the hum of fluorescent lights, the small sighs of a sleeping child in an adjacent room. Eleanor felt something shifting in her chest, a calcification dissolving that she hadn't consciously recognized as present. I want to make our arrangement more permanent. Not security, you were right to refuse that, but advisor, chief problem solver. Someone who sees what I miss because I'm too close to see clearly. Someone who cares about integrity more than optimization. Marcus studied her face, reading subtext she hadn't intended to communicate. My office is here. My title is whatever doesn't require business cards. My hours are whenever Lily doesn't need me. I work on problems that matter, not politics. And I'm expensive not in money, but in requiring absolute honesty. No corporate games, no strategic information management. You tell me the truth, I solve the problem. That's the deal. Eleanor extended her hand across the workbench, scarred by years of honest labor. Deal. They shook on it, the gesture sealing something that felt more significant than a consulting arrangement. Eleanor was acquiring not just an advisor, but a compass, someone whose moral certainty could guide her through territories where her own judgment had proven unreliable. The next morning arrived with October sunshine that suggested summer's ghost had returned for a final appearance. 3 helicopters descended on the industrial district with a precision that scattered pigeons and drew every neighborhood resident to their windows. They landed in the cleared lot beside Marcus's garage, their rotors creating miniature storms of dust and leaves. Eleanor emerged from the lead helicopter wearing clothing that split the difference between corporate and casual, acknowledging that boardrooms and garages required different armor. She walked toward Marcus, who was methodically tightening a bolt on an ancient pickup, apparently unimpressed by aerial arrivals. The board wants to make this official. Vice President of Strategic Innovation Office, adjacent to mine compensation package, that would make venture capitalists envious. Marcus completed his torque measurement before responding. I already gave you my terms. I know, so I had them redraft the offer. Your office is here. Your title is Chief Problem Solver because apparently legal said we can call you whatever we want as long as the paperwork is filed correctly. Your hours are flexible around Lily's needs, and the compensation is quarterly payment of exactly $75 because some things are worth more than money could measure. The callback to their first transaction landed with intended significance. Marcus allowed himself a smile that suggested he had been outmaneuvered by someone who had learned from watching him work. You're learning to see systems instead of just optimizing them. I had a good teacher, so is that a yes? Marcus glanced toward the office where Lily was beginning a new drawing, her small hands already stained with crayon in multiple colors. It's a yes, but we're clear, my job is protecting the integrity of your company's soul, not its stock price. Sometimes those align, sometimes they conflict. When they conflict, soul wins. Agreed. And Marcus, thank you for seeing what I couldn't, for fixing what I'd broken without realizing it, for showing me that walls can be doors if you're brave enough to walk through them. The final scene belonged not to boardrooms or garages, but to the park where ordinary life happened in defiance of corporate drama. Marcus pushed Lily on the swing, her laughter a counterpoint to the autumn wind. Eleanor sat on a nearby bench, no longer an outsider observing normalcy, but a participant in it, watching the ritual of father and daughter with something that felt like belonging. Lily called out for Eleanor to watch a particularly ambitious arc, and Eleanor watched fully present in the moment, rather than calculating 3 moves ahead. The broken supercar that had brought her to this garage felt like an artifact from someone else's life, a symbol of machinery so complex it required catastrophic failure to reveal simpler truths. A family had formed from wreckage and trust, from a child's question about helping and a father's promise to his daughter. Not traditional, not conventional, but whole in ways that Eleanor was only beginning to understand. She thought about bluebirds flying through yellow skies, about how happiness had colors that changed depending on who was feeling them, about the quiet heroism of choosing presence over power. The swing reached its apex, Lily suspended for a fraction of a second in perfect equilibrium between earth and sky. Marcus steadied the chains, his hands ensuring safety while allowing freedom. Eleanor pulled out her phone and photographed the moment, not for social media or corporate narrative, but simply because some things deserve to be remembered in their uncomplicated truth. The city stretched beyond the park in different and eternal towers reaching toward clouds in humanity's eternal attempt to escape gravity through engineering. But here in this all space where grass grew and children laughed, a different kind of achievement had been accomplished. The building of connection without contract. The creation of family from choice rather than obligation. The discovery that some walls existed only because no one had tried the door. Eleanor's phone buzzed with messages demanding attention, press inquiries, investor questions, board members seeking debriefs. She glanced at the screen and then deliberately put it away. Those demands would still exist in an hour. This moment would not. She had spent 20 years optimizing for the future at the expense of the present. Today, she chose differently. Lily ran over breathless and joyful, holding a dandelion she had picked with the conviction that it was a flower rather than a weed. She presented it to Eleanor with the same solemnity she had shown with the bluebird drawing. For you, because you're not sad anymore. Eleanor accepted the gift, feeling something crack and reform in her chest. You're right, I think I'm not. The three of them walked back toward the garage as afternoon shadows lengthened their steps, falling into an unconscious rhythm that suggested synchronization beyond conscious design. Marcus's hand rested lightly on Lily's shoulder, guiding without controlling. Eleanor walked beside them, close enough to be included, but respecting the boundary of their existing bond. Tomorrow would bring complications, legal proceedings against Julian, contract negotiations with the Pentagon, the endless machinery of corporate existence grinding forward. But tomorrow's problems could wait. Today had delivered something rarer than success: redemption connection. The discovery that strength could be found not in towers of glass, but in garages smelling of honest work, not in stock portfolios, but in 6-year-olds who believed helping was always the right answer. The helicopters had departed, their dramatic arrival reduced to a story the neighborhood would tell for weeks. The garage door rolled down with the familiar sound of metal on metal, enclosing the space where broken things came to be made whole. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythms. Inside, three people who had been alone discovered the mathematics of belonging, that 1 + 1 + 1 could equal something greater than simple addition, that family was a verb rather than a noun, that the highest walls could indeed become doors if you found the courage to simply walk through.